Hello, and thanks for joining me today for episode 747 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I am looking forward to resharing our interview with our guest, Dr. Jennifer Ramp Neale, originally released on April 9th of 2018. Listeners, Jennifer is an expert in biodiversity and rare plant conservation. Her research focuses on applied conservation of plants, particularly rare and endangered species in Colorado. And in our interview, Jennifer shared lots of advice, stories, and research. So listeners, get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the People Behind the Science podcast. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you all to our guest, Dr. Jennifer Ramp Neale. So, Jenny, thank you so much for joining us today. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing quite well. Thanks for asking. And thank you for taking time out of your busy day to spend with us to talk about your experiences in life and science. But before we dive into all of the details, Jenny, I do want to take a moment to introduce you to our listeners. So listeners, Jenny is the Director of Research and Conservation at the Denver Botanic Gardens. She's also an Adjunct Professor of Biology at the University of Northern Colorado and at the University of Colorado, Denver. Jenny received her bachelor's in biology from Rhodes College and her Ph.D. in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from the University of Colorado. Afterwards, she conducted postdoctoral research in community genetics at the University of Colorado, and her previous positions include Manager of Research Programs and Associate Director of Research at the Denver Botanic Gardens, as well as Conservation Genetic Consultant with the LSA Associates and Solano County Water Agency through the University of Colorado Museum. Jenny is the recipient also of the 2012 Partners in Mission Recovery Champion Award as part of the Rare Plant Conservation Initiative from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And she is here today, listeners, to talk to us about her experiences in life and science. So Jenny, we want to get to know you both as a scientist and as a human being. So can you start by telling us what you like to do with your time when you're not very busy doing work in science?
I am a wife and mother. I have two daughters who are both in elementary school. So spend a lot of time with my family, and we are all incredibly active people. We play soccer and we ski, as well as we do a lot of camping around Colorado. So I'm generally outside doing something fun when I'm not at work, enjoying the beautiful place where I work or holed up in my office.
Absolutely. So is it hard to turn off the plant biologist when you're sort of out hiking and camping with your family?
Yes, it is. I frequently will bring my taxonomic keys with me, and there's the days that I don't make it very far from the car. So my husband knows a lot about the plants of Colorado, as do my children, and the fungi as well. We spend a lot of time trying to identify the mushrooms as well as the plants.
That's awesome. So your daughter's starting to get interested in science as well?
Yes, they are. And one of them is actually obsessed with space at the moment.
Ooh.
So she's an aspiring astronaut.
I love it. Well, Jenny, great to hear more about life outside of science. I know science has a way of creeping into that as well, but I do want to talk about your work next. So can you tell us how you describe the work that you do there at the Botanic Gardens?
I feel like I have a really great, interesting position here at the Gardens. So the Botanic Gardens is an accredited museum through the American Alliance of Museums, and we are also a very public nonprofit. And my role as the Director of Research and Conservation is to largely oversee the science that we do here at the Gardens. And there are a lot of different components that fall under the science here at the Gardens, but a lot of what I do is also communicate about science, why science is important, and help translate the work that we're doing in our department to the greater public. We like to focus our efforts in the Department of Research and Conservation on applied conservation. So we really work closely with land managers and landowners around Colorado, but also more broadly than that. And we like to use the data and scientific methodology to help inform land management. So we know that we are not the land managers, we are not the landowners, so we're not the ones making the on-the-ground decisions. However, we conduct really rigorous scientific studies in order to provide the land managers with the best data in order to make those land management decisions. So I get to play this great role of working in a museum, which is a public institution, and educating the public about museums, as well as working with landowners and helping them understand the science of what's happening with the plants in particular on the lands that they manage.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you have a phenomenal mix of responsibilities there at the museum. And I think that can be exciting, but also a lot to take on. So I always like to talk to scientists about what motivates them and inspires them, because I think life can get a little bit hectic sometimes. So I'm always on the lookout for motivational sayings and quotes and things that I can use in my own life. So Jenny, do you have some of yours that you'd like to share with us today?
It's funny, I don't have specifically one quote in particular that I like to go to, but I do have this picture on the wall in my office of the two hippos called George and Martha. Mm-hmm. And they're from a children's book that's similar to Frog and Toad from the late 70s. And in one of the stories called The Experiment, Martha is studying fleas. And George says to her, "Cute little critters, aren't they?" And Martha says, "This is serious. This is science." And I really like that because I feel like I am very similar to Martha in that I take what I do very seriously, but it can also be very fun. And to some people, it's just cute plant. What are you doing? Right. So it's kind of a good way to just frame what I do. But then I also just like to think about, we have a departmental vision and mission, and our vision is a biodiverse world. So I really like to frame everything that we do and how I approach things within the context of that vision of documenting and protecting biodiversity and investigating and explaining those patterns and processes that we see in biodiversity. And so kind of thinking about that and just striving towards that protection of biodiversity, but then also realizing that some people might just see it as a variety of species or just cool plants, and kind of that balance between the scientific side and the more just aesthetic, cool, neat side.
Absolutely. And I love that it sounds like in your position, you're exposed to a lot of different perspectives on the work that you do, to nature in general, and also having to communicate to this variety of different audiences. Can you talk a little bit about what that's like, trying to do this balance?
It's definitely tricky. And I've been at the Gardens for 11 years, and it's taken me some time to really grow into being comfortable with that. As a graduate student, your training related to communication is primarily in writing scientific papers and giving presentations at scientific conferences. So I've certainly had to learn how to be more comfortable doing the public presentations and ad hoc interactions with visitors and members. We do a lot of behind the scenes tours here in our department of our natural history collections in particular. So I've just spent a lot of time just really practicing how to communicate effectively with all of those different stakeholders and audiences. And I feel like I'm always improving as well.
Absolutely. I think it's a constant process of growth and struggle. So now I'd love to hear a little bit more about the people who you've interacted with over the course of your career. And in particular, are there any for you, Jenny, that really stick out as influential mentors or role models or people that had a big impact on you?
Yeah. When I was an undergraduate at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, I had a biology professor named Dr. Terry Hill, and he taught several of the courses that I took. I took a couple of really intensive lab classes, one in monoclonal antibodies, where we actually developed antibodies, and one in actual electron microscopy. And he taught those as well as some other cellular level classes. And he was just a really great motivator and encouraged me to continue to pursue science after I left undergrad, which I really appreciate. And I'm still in touch with him today. And then my doctoral mentors, Dr. Tom Ranker and Dr. Sharon Collins, were both just really supportive and just great role models for me, and understood that academia might not be the way that I was going to go. And they really just supported me pursuing what I was interested in and seeing where it led. And then since I've been at the Gardens, I would say I have a lot of fantastic colleagues at other botanic gardens in similar positions who've provided a really great peer structure for me. Kay Havens at Chicago Botanic Gardens and Joyce Mashinsky, who's currently with the Center for Plant Conservation, have been really great role models and colleagues along the way.
Absolutely. Well, it sounds like you've had a bounty of great role models and mentors. And I really like this idea you brought up of your mentors being supportive of the fact that ending up in a traditional academic institution might not be the path that you took. And I think this is really important and relevant today for our PhD students and people out there who might be listening to the program. And I understand that at the Botanic Gardens, you work with students as well. And this is sort of a way that they can get involved in a more non-traditional route. So can you talk a little bit about these opportunities?
Ever since I've been at the Gardens, I have played a role in helping to mentor graduate students through the various universities. As you mentioned, my adjunct affiliations, I've served on committees at multiple universities, but in the last few years, we actually really launched our own graduate degree program with master's and PhD students through the University of Colorado, Denver. There are 5 of us at the Botanic Gardens who hold a PhD who are in a position where we can directly mentor graduate students. So we have had a couple of master's students and we have a couple of PhD students at the moment. None of them are currently working directly with me, but I serve on several of their committees. And our goal with that graduate program is really to expose students to a scientific institution outside of academia and to train them in the applied aspects of what we do, whether it be working with plants and restoration, insects and documenting biodiversity, or fungal studies. So we're really trying to help provide that well-rounded educational mentoring experience for the students who work with us, but their degree and all of their coursework is really done directly through the University of Colorado, Denver, with us serving as their mentors.
Very cool. Well, listeners, definitely keep these kinds of opportunities in mind as you ponder your own career path. And I'm a little bit interested to hear, Jenny, where your career path started. We talked about some of these experiences you've had along the way, the people you've worked with, but if we rewind all the way back to the beginning, where did your interest in science start?
I can't necessarily pinpoint a single moment where I knew I wanted to be a scientist, but I did grow up in Colorado. My vacations were always spent camping or skiing. So I spent a lot of time outdoors. And then one summer, actually 2 summers when I was in high school, I worked at a cut flower farm, the type of place that makes bouquets that are sold at the farmer's market. And I loved working there. I loved learning the scientific names of the plants. I loved learning how to grow the plants. And I think that had a lot to do with my influence, because definitely by the time I got to undergrad, I knew I wanted to be a biology major. And the way that they did it at Rhodes was the first semester of your freshman year was botany and the second semester was zoology. So it wasn't a general biology course. Mm-hmm. And I actually really liked that. I liked the fact that they focused on plants and then animals. And I was just really drawn to the plants. And to be honest, I have never really had pets. I've never really been around a lot of animals. I'd say that I'm a bit nervous around most animals. Mm-hmm. So plants is just someplace where I'm much more comfortable. Then just through undergraduate, I participated in some independent research looking at plant roots and trying to identify potential genes that are involved in gravitropism. The professor I worked with had a grant from NASA, which I thought was really cool. And then from there, I just knew I really wanted to stay in science, and I went straight into graduate school and didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was really interested in plants and reproductive biology, and then just kind of took a class my first year of graduate school called Evolution in Action. And I learned about conservation genetics, and kind of pretty quickly throughout that class was like, that is what I want to do. I want to use genetic tools to help answer questions about conservation. So it was really in that class that I figured more what I was interested in studying. And then from there was able to move into the realm of study that I'm still in. And I just got really lucky that a position was open at the Botanic Gardens shortly after I finished my degree. And I was lucky enough to be hired down here. And I've been here now for 11 years.
Absolutely. And I know you also worked while at the Gardens as a conservation genetic consultant as well. Can you tell us what this was about?
So for my dissertation, I had done population genetic work on a rare species found in vernal pools out in California. And the consulting company actually contacted me while I was doing my dissertation and asked if I wanted to do a more robust study. Fortunately, when I finished my degree, I didn't actually have a position lined up. So I was able to actually set up a consulting contract with them and stay at the university doing a much more in-depth study of the same species, Lacenia conjugans. And in this case, I actually was able to work with another company to develop microsatellites and analyze those across the species range. That work started while I was at the university. And then I continued that after I moved down to start working at the gardens. So that was kind of a nice bridge position for me.
Certainly. And I know you've then had experience both kind of in a traditional academic setting as well as here at the Denver Botanic Gardens. Can you talk a little bit about some of the main differences that you think are with your position there at the gardens compared to that quote unquote traditional academic post?
I would say one of the biggest shocks to my system when I moved to the gardens was I didn't really have a lot of colleagues. We had a very small research department when I joined, and the director of the department at the time was actually half-time at the gardens and half-time at the University of Denver. So she was only actually at the gardens physically 2 days a week, and I was the first full-time salaried staff person to be hired in the department for many, many years. There were a couple of other full-time staff working on plant records and one woman who was working on demographic studies of rare plants. So I just came from this big university setting where there's lots of colleagues and there's weekly seminars to a very small department where there's not a lot of other scientists. That was a bit of a shock. But then over the last 11 years, we've actually really grown the size of our department, and we now have 11 staff plus the 3 graduate students. So I feel like we are creating a community of scientists here. And we also hold a weekly journal club, and we invite graduate students and professors from some of the local universities to come and participate. It's actually grown to a fairly nice size. We also have several orphaned PhDs who live in the Denver area that are working on their own or doing consulting, and they often come to that. And so I feel like we're trying to really create that more rigorous academic research community here. But I also feel like one of the other differences is I have this great opportunity to interact with the public and the members of the gardens on a regular basis. And that's something that you don't have a lot of access to when you're at an academic institution. I'm regularly asked, as I mentioned earlier, to give these behind the scenes tours or give a talk to donors or conduct a science chat in our science pyramid where I interact with whomever might be at the gardens that day. And I really enjoy that opportunity. Mm-hmm. Members of the public are really curious and they ask a lot of really interesting questions that often I have to think about and we have a conversation about. And it's actually really reinvigorating to go out there and interact with the public on a regular basis and then come back and get back into some of the nitty gritty of it. But I felt like that was a really nice bonus of being at a public institution that I didn't feel when I was at an academic institution.
Absolutely. And I know you guys are doing some great research there at the Denver Botanic Gardens now. So Jenny, is there a project that you're currently working on that you are really excited about and want to tell us about in more detail?
Yeah, so for the last several years, I have been working on various conservation genetic projects with Colorado's rarest plant species. One of the projects that I'm really trying to wrap up and get out the door is on the North Park Phacelia or Phacelia formicula. It's a federally listed plant that's found only in the northern part of central Colorado. And we've been working on this project for many years where we have genetic tissue samples from populations across its range. And there are 2 different primary locations. The bulk of the populations are found in Jackson County. And then a couple of populations were found in 2004 in Larimer County, which is on the other side of a small mountain range. And their taxonomic identity has been uncertain. So we are not sure if they are Phacelia formicula or if they are something else. So part of our goal with this study is to look at the genetic data and assess whether or not we think the populations in Larimer County are the same species or not. And of course, it's complicated. So we have gone back and we have collected a lot of morphological data. We've done leaf morphometric analyses. We're doing ecological niche modeling with species distribution models. We're doing soil assessments and really trying to collect multiple lines of evidence to do this integrative taxonomic approach to assess whether or not we think those populations in Larimer County are the same thing or not. Mm-hmm. And I feel like it's been a project that we've struggled with because it is complicated and there are so many different lines of evidence that we have. And of course, they don't necessarily all say the same thing. But I feel like we're getting much closer to wrapping up our story and being able to publish it. And really, this is one of those cases where it will have direct implications for the Bureau of Land Management and the Fish and Wildlife Service, whatever it is that we end up concluding, because they're the ones who manage this rare species.
Absolutely. And I love that you're able to work on these rare species that are so close to home for you. And I think when people think of rare plants, they might not think immediately about a place like Colorado. So can you tell us a little bit about why these plants are so rare, what some of the threats are?
There are actually 16 plant species in Colorado that are protected under the Endangered Species Act. Interestingly, most of them occur in what we call the barrens habitat. So not what most people envision as typical Colorado habitat. They're not necessarily alpine species, although there are a couple of rare species found in the alpine. Mm-hmm. They're mostly found on the western slope of Colorado, which is that western edge of the state into Utah, really, where they're on these barren habitats where there's not a lot of other vegetation. So they're primarily soil specialists or edaphic endemics, meaning that they most likely evolved in the isolation of a lot of other competition. We do suspect that most of them are naturally rare. However, with a lot of oil and gas exploration happening in Colorado, a lot of urbanization happening, as well as off-road vehicles, those are the primary threats to our rare taxa. Invasive species is certainly another issue, but really it's those urbanization, roads, things like that, that's actually a bigger impact for our rare species. So we are really working with all of the rare taxa in some level in order to help understand them, protect them.
Certainly. Well, you're doing phenomenal work there, Jenny, and great to hear about some of these projects and how you got to this current position where you are today. But we haven't yet touched on many of the challenges and the struggles, and I think these are overly abundant in the career of a scientist. So I do love giving them some airtime on our program. So do you have a favorite failure or a challenge or a struggle that you've gone through that you can tell us about and share with our listeners how you worked through it?
My biggest what I saw as a failure at the time was trying to publish the second chapter of my dissertation. And I know that all young scientists struggle with getting things published and feeling like their work was good enough. But my second chapter of my dissertation, I just really struggled with. I submitted it to multiple journals. I would get requests for revisions. I would make the revisions. It would get rejected. That happened to me at multiple journals. And I think in the end, I ended up with comments from no fewer than 20 reviewers and or editors on my manuscript. Wow. And they were often contradictory, which was very challenging, trying to figure out how to address it.
Right.
And then ultimately my paper, after, it must have been 18 months almost of pretty near constant submission and rejection.
Wow.
Finally got accepted at Plant Species Biology and ended up winning Best Paper of the Year through that journal, which astounded me, but was also very rewarding to show me that maybe I wasn't really looking at the right journals to begin with. And I really needed to reframe the way that I was presenting the data to make it more broad than just this one single species. Because I do feel like with my dissertation, I worked on one rare taxon, and it was very easy for me to frame everything within the context of that one species. But for publication, really, they want things to be more broad. And it was very hard for me to stretch my thinking to make it more applicable on a bigger scale. So in the end, I think it turned out to be a nice paper, but it was incredibly frustrating and just challenging. And that was also during my first year here at the Gardens, and was just pretty hard to take some days when I'd get another rejection.
Right. Well, congratulations. It sounds like the struggle was worth it in the end, though. So the story has a happy ending. I like that.
Yeah. And I would say, too, that I still struggle with publication. Being at a public institution where I report directly to our CEO, and while he is incredibly supportive and really likes the science, me publishing papers is not as important. And my time is very much divided, as we've talked about, between multiple tasks. So finding the time to really sit down and write and work on the science is kind of a personal challenge that I face. And I really aim to get things published. And I have several of these studies that are nearly done. They're just kind of sitting on my desk, and I really need to find the time to get them out the door. And that's something that I feel like I'm currently struggling with, and constantly needing to force myself to keep going because it's easy to be discouraged.
Definitely. Well, I think even at academic institutions where perhaps there is a higher emphasis or priority placed on those publications, people are still having the same troubles. They tend to pile up on your desk and you keep looking over at them.
I know.
So you're not alone.
That helps. Knowing that I'm not alone definitely helps.
Absolutely. Well, Jenny, we don't just want to talk about the tough times, but thank you for sharing these stories with me and our listeners today. Next, I'd love to talk about some of your success stories, whether they're the big wins or even just small victories that were really meaningful for you personally.
Well, I did have one paper published last year, which was a primer note, which was the first step of that Phacelia paper. So getting the primer note out the door on the microsatellites we developed really helped open up our ability to then focus on what we did with those microsatellites. So that was a success for me last year. And then as the director of a department of scientists, I have the great pleasure of being able to talk about a lot of the work that's done by my team. And 4 members of the department actually just published a paper that came out earlier in 2018 in Biodiversity and Conservation on using herbarium specimens to look at climate change in the Alpine of Colorado. So they were able to look at a massive number of herbarium records, not just from our own herbarium, but from these massive data sets like iDigBio, and look at climate change in Colorado and whether or not things are blooming earlier. And they found that over a 61-year timeframe, most species are blooming earlier of the ones that they assessed. And so I am lucky enough that I get to be the one to help talk about the work that my team did. Certainly was engaged in levels of it, but it feels really good to have this departmental paper where it was very cross-collaborative across the department of my team working together to produce this great paper that is now out in publication.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations on both of these papers being published. And I'm curious, does your department have a particular way they like to celebrate these team wins?
Well, we are lucky enough to work in a fabulous place. Our offices are currently located in the basement. Mm-hmm. So we do have to remind ourselves to get out and go walk around the beautiful gardens that we do work in. So when we have grant proposals funded or we have publications come out, we do tend to go out into the gardens and go get some ice cream or take a walk or celebrate in that way.
It is so important to take that break and reflect on the successes because I think, like you alluded to in your dissertation story, sometimes it is 18 months before the next one comes along. And that's a lot of struggle along the way that you deserve to reward yourself for.
Sometimes it's hard to remember to take that time, but it's always good when we do.
Absolutely. And one thing that I love talking to scientists about on our show, in addition to the phenomenal work that they're doing, are some of the books that they're reading. I love giving book recommendations to our listeners and adding books to my own reading list all the time. So do you have a favorite book, Jenny, that you've read, or maybe one that you've just read recently and enjoyed, that you want to tell us about today, whether it's a science book or a non-science book?
Yeah, I have a fairly decent commute to the gardens, and so I often will listen to audiobooks in the car. Mm-hmm. And I recently listened to the book, The Paris Architect by Charles Belfour, and it's set in Paris during World War II. And it's about an architect who is simultaneously working for the Nazis, building factories and building secret hiding places for Jews inside apartments. And just kind of the struggle that he's going through with those two very different things that he's working on. And it was just a fascinating book. It's not a true story, but it very likely could have been. And it was a really great book to listen to. So I really enjoyed that one. And then another book that I am always recommending to anyone interested in ecology or plants is The Song of the Dodo by David Quammen. It's quite a thick book, but it's all about evolution and island biogeography. And David Quammen's really following in the footsteps of Alfred Russel Wallace, who also developed the theory of evolution in parallel to Darwin. And that one's just a really great story about the diversity of species on the planet and has a lot to do with extinction. So it can be a little discouraging at times, but it's a great read as well.
Awesome. Great recommendations. Well, I will put The Paris Architect and Song of the Dodo out on our website for our listeners to find if they're looking for another great book to read. And we've talked about some of the different places that you've been, Jenny, for your academic training and while you're working there at the Denver Museum, certainly doing field research. And I think this travel is a big part of the life of a scientist. So do you have a favorite place in particular that you've been for your own work? And can you tell us about it and why it was so memorable?
Well, in addition to being able to travel around the amazing state of Colorado and see a lot of non-touristy places, I have had the privilege of traveling internationally for various conferences. And a couple of years ago, I got to travel to Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa to attend a conference. And the conference was the Science in Botanic Gardens Congress. So it was essentially scientists from botanic gardens across the world getting together and talking about how we at Botanic Gardens conducting science really do play this interface between the core scientific research that's happening and the public, and how we are all working towards conservation of rare species. We talked a lot about the global strategy for plant conservation and the role that Botanic Gardens plays within that strategy. And it was just an amazing place to be, but it was a really great community to connect with on an international level.
Well, that's really cool. So I guess in day-to-day life, is there a lot of cross-communication or interaction between botanic gardens at different locations?
Yeah. So both in the United States, I'm part of this group called the Center for Plant Conservation, which is a consortium of, I think it's over 40 botanic gardens and similar institutions that are all working to protect America or North America's vanishing flora. So we all conduct research, we steward rare species, we do a lot of seed collection for ex situ conservation. A lot of the gardens are doing reintroductions and restoration work, and they're a great community of my peers essentially at Botanic Gardens. And then internationally, through Botanic Gardens Conservation International, that is a large group of botanic gardens that are all interested in plant conservation, in addition to just being botanic gardens that are holding living collections. There's a lot of other gardens globally that are doing conservation efforts to help document and protect species where they are. So I really enjoy connecting with both of those communities.
Well, that is phenomenal. And going back to this conference you mentioned in the Canary Islands, it sounds like a remarkable destination for a conference. So can you tell us a little bit about what you did there and if you were able to maybe escape the conference hall for a few hours to enjoy the sunshine?
Yeah, the conference was over probably 3 or 4 days and was in this fabulous venue that we could walk to from the hotel. And we did get to do a field trip to the Botanic Garden on the island and really see the Canary Islands have a really unique flora. They have a lot of endemic taxa, and they do great genetic work and taxonomic work as well as seed collection. And so we were able to see their facilities and talk with their scientists, which was really neat. And then I had great fun because my best friend actually lives in Stockholm, Sweden, flew in to visit me for a few days. So when the conference ended, she and I rented a car and drove around the island and spent 3 days hanging out and catching up. So that was also fantastic.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful trip. And I love that you brought into our conversation a couple times today this element of the human side of science with the work that you're doing, interfacing with the public and working with your colleagues and being able to reconnect with friends. And I think this human aspect of science is something that not a lot of people appreciate or maybe realize as part of science. So I love highlighting it on our program and talking about just some of the fun and funny things that scientists do when they're together, because I think it is contrary to a lot of the stereotypes that people have about scientists. So Jenny, do you have a particular tradition that you've experienced or just a fun or funny memory that you've shared with scientific colleagues that really showcases this human side of science?
I've thought about that. We don't necessarily have a tradition per se. We certainly always bring our Cheetos cheese puffs when we go on field work. Mm-hmm. I feel like the car is not allowed to leave the parking lot unless we have the Cheetos in the car.
Makes sense.
Which is funny because I don't think the rest of us eat them any other time.
Really? It's your fieldwork food. Yeah.
Exactly. But then I'm a big fan of that hashtag field fail. I feel like we all have these moments where you're in the field and something ridiculous happens and you've accidentally stepped on the rare species that you're there to monitor, or you get stuck in the mud or things like that. So I feel like lots of those things happen and you just have to roll with it along the way and be able to laugh at yourself and just realize that, like I was saying at the beginning, not everything is serious. Right. Even though we might take ourselves very seriously, it often turns comical.
Absolutely. So do you have a favorite field fail memory?
I'm sure I could come up with several, but there was a time I was doing fieldwork in Hawaii with my former advisor, Tom Ranker, and we were looking for this one fern for his work and had not been able to find it. And it was super muddy and wet. And I, of course, stepped in some giant mud puddle up to basically a thigh.
Oh, wow.
And had to be pulled out of the mud and was just filthy. And I think it was like the first day, and that was the only pair of field shoes I had. And it was just one of those like, okay, well, win in the tropics.
Right. Embrace the mud. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm not used to mud in Colorado.
That's right. Well, I love this. It sounds like you and your colleagues are able to have fun out there while you're doing work as well, which I think is really important.
Yeah.
So we talked about some of the big questions that you're working to answer there at the Botanic Gardens. And I think you've got a lot of great projects going on, but oftentimes there's something that stands between you and the perfect research project, whether it's funding or staff or technology or feasibility or time. So Jenny, if I could give you any or all of these things, what is the one project you would want to tackle or the one question you would want to ask?
Well, getting back to the rare species within Colorado, there is so much that we just don't know about the rare taxa in Colorado. And so I would really love to conduct these comprehensive dynamic studies for all of our rare taxa and really understand their taxonomic identity through phylogenetic assessments, their population genetic diversity across the species range, pollination biology, reproductive biology with seed dispersal, what specific soils are they restricted to, and just really learn a lot more about our taxa. I feel like so many of them are lacking protection just because we just don't know that much about them. Mm-hmm. We don't know how long they live. We don't know what their germination requirements are. And it just makes it really tricky to protect them because there's so much that we just don't know. I would love to be able to collect that level of really robust data on all of our rare taxa.
Absolutely. And would you want to start with or stay with just Colorado plants?
I think for now, I would want to stay with Colorado plants. There's so many that just have great stories that I already know about them, and I just want to know more about them. And so I think I would stick with Colorado for the time being.
I like it. Well, this is a big, ambitious sort of question that needs to be answered here, Jenny.
Yeah.
We'll just need one or two more resources.
Yeah. I got a career ahead of me.
Yeah. Well, phenomenal to hear about the questions that keep you up at night, Jenny. And I love talking about the different things that you've done along your career path. And I think we've talked about some of the people who've had a big impact on you. And another thing that they can do for you is give you great advice. So Jenny, I want you to think back over the course of your career. And is there one piece of advice that really helped you that you can pass on to our listeners today?
I can't think of a specific piece of advice, but I think it goes back to that level of support that I had in graduate school of just pursue what it is that you're interested in, and you'll figure it out along the way. You don't have to know what career path you want to go into. You don't have to know exactly what you want to do or even exactly what you want to study. I very much went to graduate school because I knew I wanted to keep doing science, and everybody I knew who'd graduated before me with a degree in biology was not doing a biology-oriented job. So I went to grad school just because I really wanted to keep studying biology. And I felt really supported in those decisions, not just by my professors along the way, but by my family as well. My parents are a retired school teacher, and my dad works at a hardware store. Mm-hmm. And they just always really supported me in whatever decisions I wanted to make. And when I said I wanted to go to graduate school, they might have thought I was kind of crazy, but they never questioned it. And I just really appreciated that support to kind of figure things out as I went. And even though I never had a clear path to where I am, I feel like I'm really happy with where I've ended up.
Definitely. Well, I'm so glad you brought this up today because I think you're absolutely right. Sometimes you do just have to kind of follow your passion and the path will open up ahead of you. You can't necessarily plan for all of these things ahead of time.
Exactly.
Definitely. Well, great message to leave our listeners with. Is there any last advice you want to give them or a last note of inspiration you'd like to give them today?
I would say, particularly for those early on in their career, to just figure out what tools you're missing and figure out how to get those skill sets. So when I became the director of research and conservation here at the Gardens, I did not have a very robust background in budget management and HR personnel kind of things. And I found training courses either locally here in Denver, or I participated in a Ecological Society of America training for directors of biological programs. And I found those things to be super helpful in helping me figure out how to be a good leader and how to be an effective administrator. And I found that sometimes I had to look in non-traditional places for those tools. I've participated in lots of webinars, and I just feel like finding that training where I feel less confident about my background or my existing training has been really helpful in helping me to bring in multiple things into my toolbox in order to effectively run a research program here at the Gardens.
Absolutely. Well, fantastic advice to give our listeners. Jenny, can you tell them if they want to learn more about you in the Denver Botanic Gardens, where should they go?
They can visit the Botanic Gardens website, which is www.botanicgardens.org, or you could just Google Denver Botanic Gardens. And there is a section on there called Science and Conservation, and we are located under there. You can read a little bit about our projects, about the amazing staff on my team, and you can contact me through there.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out that website. And Jenny, thank you so much for joining us on the show today and sharing a piece of your own story.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it was a pleasure to chat with you, and listeners, great to have you here as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.